What's going on? As promised, I put out there that I was going to do a two-part series of Jesus in the Old Testament. And, you know, when we talk about Jesus in the Old Testament, we're faced with all kind of accusations of that Jesus is just in the New Testament, and there's nowhere to be seen that Jesus in the Old Testament, and there's no hint of the Trinity in the Old Testament or anything like that. Anything that points to a Trinity, anything that points to Jesus being God. You know, the Christian is always levied by those who are outside of the Christian worldview with accusations of just creating Jesus out of nowhere in the Old Testament. But that just simply isn't true. When we consider and we look at the Old Testament and we consider the text of what's being said, we see Jesus in the Old Testament. We see that foreshadowing. We see those typologies. We see those theophanies. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be talking about Jesus Christ, the typologies, and the theophanies of Christ that we've seen in the Old Testament that gave a foreshadowing or a symbolic reference to Christ being coming to fruition, being that promised Messiah that we see in the New Testament. But before we go into the lesson, I do want to encourage you to go ahead and like and follow on the Facebook page, The Gospel Truth. And also I want to encourage you to go ahead and subscribe to YouTube, to The Gospel Truth on YouTube, if you could. I hope it doesn't take too much time out of your busy schedule, but I really encourage you to go ahead and cut those notification bells on so that you'll be notified whenever I upload new content and whenever I go live. Because over here at The Gospel Truth, we have a whole bunch of stuff going on. But with that said, I do want to get into this lesson. I don't want to take too much time going through that. But yeah, I want to start off by reading a verse that I think points to pretty much the full circumference of this study. So I want to read John chapter 5, verse 46. And it says, "For if you believed Moses, you would believe me. For he wrote about me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words?" So we see there that Jesus Christ is basically, this is in the New Testament, might also add, that Jesus Christ is basically telling those who are listening, the audience at that time, that Moses wrote about me. So the whole goal of this study is to show that Jesus Christ was telling the truth, that Moses did write about him. And it's clearly seen throughout text. Throughout the Old Testament text, it's clearly seen that we see these foreshadowings, and we see these typologies, we see these Christophanies or theophanies of Christ. And we have no choice but to conclude that Christ is God, because some of these words and some of these phrases used are pointing to Yahweh, the God of the Bible, Jehovah. You know, so there's no other conclusion that we could come to when we consider what the biblical text says concerning these things. So why is it important that we understand that Jesus in the Old Testament? For one, Jesus in the Old Testament shows that Jesus is not someone only in the New Testament, but also in the Old Testament. And like I said before, that's extremely important for us to understand that Jesus is not just in the New Testament, but also in the Old Testament. Because once again, you have those who believe that Jesus Christ is not in the Old Testament, that Jesus Christ is born, a person born. He's human. He has no deity. So it's important for us to be able to establish that, not from our own just desires, but let the Bible defend itself. Reason number two that it's important, that why the study is important, is that Jesus in the Old Testament shows that Jesus is the promised Messiah of the Old Testament. Of the New Testament. He is the promised Messiah of the New Testament. So we see that Jesus Christ in the Old Testament was foreshadowed as a Messiah coming, and we also see that in the New Testament in the full fruition of that promise, coming to full revelation, that special revelation, if you will, of the Jesus Christ being the Messiah, being the anointed one, being the one who will atone for the sins of the world, save his people, that Jesus Christ. So that's why when we look at Jesus in the Old Testament, it shows that he is the promised Messiah of the Old Testament, and we see that in the New Testament. Reason number three that the study is important is Jesus in the Old Testament shows that Jesus is God. As I said, there are phrases that are being used in the Old Testament that you can't help but conclude that this person is referencing Yahweh, God. So this physical, tangible person that these characters in the Old Testament are conversing with and dealing with, this person is a physical person. So who will we conclude it as if the text says, when we do word studies, that it's Yahweh, that it interprets to be Yahweh? So, we see these, once again, these Christophanies, Theophanies, that point to Jesus Christ being God. Reason number 4 is that Jesus in the Old Testament shows that the unique relationship with the Father. We see throughout the New Testament that Jesus makes himself equal with the Father. One area is John chapter 14, where we see that the Father, that Jesus Christ sees himself. If you see the Father, if you see me, you have seen the Father. We also read over in Hebrews where he says that it wasn't no problem, it wasn't no issue of Jesus Christ being equal with God, or it wasn't really no issue with that. But he lowered himself, lower than the angels, in order to come down in God in human flesh to atone for the sin. We read that in Hebrews. So we see these ideas in the New Testament. But if we look in the Old Testament, we also see this unique relationship between the Son and the Father, how these names are interchanged together, where it's obviously a physical person there, somebody who's referring to himself as the Son of God, but you see that equality there. It's a unique relationship there. And lastly, Jesus in the Old Testament shows the Trinity. And this is the big enchilada, if you will. Is Jesus God? Obviously, the Christian worldview would say yes, but you also have those who would say no. So, but if we see the Trinity in the Old Testament, you can't help but conclude that Jesus is God in flesh, in human form. So that's why this study is extremely important. And for this study, I'm going to go into typologies, and I'm going to do theophanies. But the rest is in part 2, I'm going to look to go into prophecies and a little more detail on that. So just sit back and just get a pen and pad if you desire to learn some of this stuff, or just listen. And if you're a person who do not believe that Jesus Christ is God, perhaps this lesson will help you conclude that Jesus Christ is God, and that the God that you're serving is not the true God, living God. So I just hope that this lesson does well for you. I hope that if you're a Christian, it helps you grow in your faith. And if you're not a Christian, I hope it I hope it speaks to your heart, and God grants you repentance through this video. So it's just flow with me here. Flow with me, and we'll get through this. First part that I want to go into is the number 1 point that I made, that by showing that Jesus in the Old Testament shows that Jesus is just not in the New Testament. And we remember that, throughout the ages, Christians have been attacked because of our belief in the Trinity. We've been attacked because of our belief that Jesus is God. And by showing that Jesus in the Old Testament will solidify the Christian's position. Because many of those who deny the deity of Christ, who deny the Trinity, they like to go to the Old Testament. They like to argue from the Old Testament a lot, saying like, we see these personal pronouns, these singular pronouns. We don't see the plural pronouns. We don't see the plurality that's in the Old Testament that we may see in the New Testament. But if we do word study, if we look and we dive into these texts, there's no doubt, Christians believe is monotheistic. We believe that there is one God, but we also believe that in that one God, there are 3 persons, 3 co-equal persons, 3 eternal persons in that one God. So it's vitally important for the Christian to be able to show in the Old Testament that Jesus is just not in the New Testament. We know that many worldviews argue that Jesus was just a man. He was a good teacher. He was a great philosopher. Yeah, he was the Son of God, but he wasn't nothing he wasn't nothing in particular. He was a historical figure. Yeah, he might have good morals. He was a good moral teacher. But is that what the Bible teaches about Jesus Christ? Was Jesus Christ God, or was Jesus Christ just a man? Many say that he was just born in Bethlehem. He was born in the New Testament of Bethlehem, and he was created. He was a creation. And the biblical text definitely teaches that he was eternal, that he coexisted with the Father. And we remember in a biblical text in the New Testament where Jesus says, "Glorify me like you were before the foundations of the earth, before the earth was created." He was speaking to the Father in his prayer. So it's important for us to understand that these type of language points to the deity of Christ, that he was pre-existent, he was eternal. Before the world was, he was. It says in the text as well that before Abraham was, I am. That's that ego eimi that we find also used in the Tetragrammaton in the Old Testament. Yahweh, when he's talking to the burning bush, that I am Yahweh, I am that I am. We see this type of language, and the same type of language that's being used by Jesus Christ is also being seen in the Old Testament. But I don't want to go too far into that. I do want to start venturing into the Theophanies. So theophany is manifestation of God that is tangible to the human senses. In its most restrictive sense, it's a visible appearance of God in the Old Testament period, often but not always in human form. Some will include in this term Christophanies, pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, and angelophanies, appearance of angels. So that's the definition of a theophany is it's physical appearance, a physical appearance upon a God making himself as a physical appearance. And we know in the biblical text that God is spirit. So how do we gather these things? How do we come to the conclusion of these things? If God is spirit and he has no human body, when we see God physically coming on and interacting with characters in the Bible, we might have some questions there, right? We have to ask these questions. And if we don't ask these questions, we find ourselves in a perplexing situation, as most non-Trinitarians and as most modalists believe. They find themselves in a cumbersome situation because they have problems with the Trinity and they have problems with the deity of Christ. So Christ theophanies, where are they found at? We see them in Genesis. We see one in Genesis chapter 12, verse 7 through 9, and where the Lord appeared to Abraham. And we see further along, and this is a very popular story in Genesis Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 33. I'm not going to read the whole verse. That's a long read, but you take time and read that. But if you remember the story, you remember that Jesus Christ appeared to Abraham and Sarah, or should I say, an angel of the Lord appeared to Abraham and Sarah. I don't want to jump too far ahead. I want the scriptures to lead you to that understanding. But we see that in Genesis chapter 1, verse 33, Abraham and Sarah had two visitors. Now, if you remember this story, I can summarize it or paraphrase it for you, is that Sarah and Abraham was promised a son. So Abraham and Sarah were a little confused and a little frustrated. They were in old age, and I'm like, how are we going to have a child? God promised us someone who will carry on the lineage, that the blessing of all nations will come through. He will come through our seed. God promised that. God kept his promise with his son Isaac. But who are these angels, these two individuals that came and visited Sarah and Abraham and told him this? We remember in this text, it says that they believed that this was a pre-incarnate Christ appearing. It is believed that. And we have to remember that Abraham and Sarah actually entertained these individuals. Entertained them. So that means you have to be physically there. Someone had to be physically there. A physical person had to be there in order to entertain, right? It says Abraham, they gave the visitors food. They gave them bread. They ate with these individuals. Abraham and Sarah did. They ate with these individuals. So who are these individuals? The person that they entertained was indeed Yahweh. It was Yahweh. And where do we get this? How do we conclude that in this particular conversation, in this particular context, that this was Yahweh? Earlier in Genesis chapter 18. In Genesis chapter 18, verse 3, we notice that Abraham referred to these individuals as Lord. At least one of the individuals as Lord. And this is Lord, lowercase l, Lord. So it would be translated to Adonai, right? So this Adonai was just simply a Lord or master. In the Greek, it'd be kurios. It'd be that would be the term in the Greek, or Lord or master, right? But we notice later on that the terminologies changed a little bit. At some point in time, Abraham was shown, or he just knew, that this was something more than just a regular Lord or a regular master, an earthly Lord or earthly master. This is someone greater. Because the phrase that's being used now at the end of it all, and by the time we get to Genesis chapter 18, verse 13, we see that the text says, and the Lord said to Abraham, And mind you, this is after Sarah laughed at the Lord for telling him and her, for the Lord telling him and her that they will have a baby in old age. So Sarah laughs. Sarah thinks it's hilarious. But the Lord stepped in and said, and the Lord, in Genesis 18:13 it says, and the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I indeed bear a child when I am old? This is a rhetorical question. This is not meant for a response. What this verse is telling us is that Sarah was laughing at the Lord for making such, according to her, a silly pronouncement, or a silly prediction. So Sarah, she's laughing, she's joking. And the Lord stepped in and corrected her. But I do not want to emphasize on just the story itself, but I do want to emphasize on the Lord. The Lord that's being used in Genesis chapter 18, verse 13 is a little different. It's not the same as the Lord that's used in Genesis 18:3. Like I said, the Genesis Lord used in 18:3 is just a Lord, like a Lord, a master. You know, Abraham just showing respect. He understood that this is someone who's greater than him in positional wise. He's not equal with Abraham. Abraham knew that, and that's why he submitted himself as a Lord or Master. But this Genesis 18:13 says, "And the Lord said to Abraham." Now, if we jump over to the Septuagint, we'll see this word, the same word "kurios," used. And that same kurios that's used in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, we see that same word kurios, the same phraseology kurios used in the New Testament for Jesus Christ, and the same word, the way the word is spelled, the same usage of the word. And that's important because if we see in the Greek translation of the Old Testament this kurios used in this particular portion of the text, and we see that same word used in different portions of the text in line with Jesus Christ, of explaining who Jesus Christ is, we can't help but conclude that Jesus Christ is Yahweh. Now, this kurios in the Greek, in the Hebrew, that same verse, the word Lord is translated as Yahweh. Yahweh is the holiest name that God, that's his name, that's who he is. We remember, and I bring up the burning bush story where Moses was at the burning bush, and Moses asked the Lord, "Who shall I say that you are?" And he said, "I am that I am." Yahweh, that same Yahweh, if it's translated that Yahweh, that I am, is just translated as Yahweh. And in the Greek, it's ego I me, I am. So we see that connection there, that Jesus Christ, that kurios in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, that kurios is the same term, same word usage is used for Jesus Christ. But we also see that I am, and we know that Jesus made several I am statements in the New Testament, and that same I am is being used as well. And that Yahweh that we see here is the Hebrew translation for the Lord in Genesis 18:13. So I rewind, right? And I bring you back to the point, if God is spirit, if he's spirit and he doesn't have a physical body, and how is Yahweh on earth unless it is Jesus? Unless it is a pre-incarnate Jesus. That points to two things. One, Jesus Christ is pre-existent. He is pre-existent. He's not just born in Bethlehem. He is pre-existent. That means that he existed eternally with the Father. That's powerful. That's powerful because like I said, I don't need to defend it. The Bible defends itself. It's just a matter of doing an honest word study. It's a matter of doing honest exegesis through the biblical text and not putting our presuppositions into the text. The text would totally defend itself. So if you're being honest with yourself in the text, you can't help but conclude that this Yahweh is Jesus Christ, the pre-incarnate Christ that came down to earth with Abraham and Sarah, ate bread with them, and told them that they were going to have a baby in their old age. You have to understand that the biblical text says what it says. Let's not push our own presuppositions in here. It's important to understand that. And we also read in Genesis 32:22-30, it's Jacob wrestling with God. We remember that story where Jacob, who eventually, after that wrestling match with God, wrestling with the angel of the Lord, his name was turned to Israel. That's when he got his name changed, Israel. And That was a physical wrestling. That wasn't symbolic. That wasn't a metaphor for anything. That was literal right there. That was absolute 100% literal of Jacob wrestling with God. We remember that story. So another part we have to understand is, what about the angel of the Lord? Right? The angel of the Lord is key, because we see this word angel of the Lord used, and we know that there has been times where angels have come down, and they've done the work of the Lord. So we don't want to confuse that, right? But we also know that angels reject worship. And we see that numerous times in the biblical text, where someone might bow down to an angel, and an angel will say, hey, don't do that, man. Don't do that, because I'm not worthy of that. We've seen it numerous times in the text. One example is in Revelation chapter 19 and 10, where it says, then I fell at his feet, worship him, but he said to me, do not do that. I am a fellow servant of yours and your brethren who hold the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. This is in Revelation chapter 19. And we see this angel, we see John. John, in this particular context, was listening to his angel, and the angel was directing him. And as he began to talk about Christ and Jesus Christ, the Lord, John fell down on his face and attempted to worship the angel. But the angel said, don't do that. Do not do that. John got up, and the angel said, worship God. So we see there that the angel rejected worship. That's just one example of many examples. But I digress from that point, because I want to be able to reemphasize the point of me bringing that up. The angel of the Lord. We read over in Joshua 5:14, it says, the commander of the army of the Lord, he said, no, rather I indeed come now as a captain of the host of the Lord. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, what has my Lord to say to his servant? The captain of the Lord's host said to Joshua, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy. And Joshua did so. We notice in Joshua chapter 5, verse 14, that Joshua bowed down and worshiped him. Now, if this was just a regular angel of the Lord, someone who just carried out certain duties of the Lord and things like that, that was not worthy of worship, why did he not tell Joshua to get up, do not worship me, just as the angel did in Revelation chapter 19 and 10? I can tell you why. Because this angel of the Lord was a pre-incarnate Christ. Has to be. It can't have no other way. This is a pre-incarnate Christ. This is a physical person right there. And he was told to take his sandals off his feet, for where he stands holy down. He did not reject worship. That's the key. He did not reject worship, as the other angel in Revelation 19:10 did reject worship. And it's important to understand that one. It's vitally important, because once again, we see the pre-incarnate Christ there. We see the pre-existence of Christ there. We see the Trinity there. We can't help but conclude that Jesus Christ is God. So if Jesus Christ is pre-eternal, pre-existent, and he's eternal with the Lord, that points to the Trinity. You can't argue that. There's no arguing away that text. And that's why this text is so powerful. And we also read in Daniel chapter 3, chapter 3, verse 24 to 26. And it says, and Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste. He said to his high officials, was it not 3 men we cast bound into the midst of the fire? They replied to the king, certainly, O king, he said. Look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm. And the appearance of the fourth is like the Son of God. Physical person there. This is a physical person there. Nebuchadnezzar saw it, and all the other idol worshippers, Babylonians, they seen it too. They seen it too. So what do you say about that? The biblical text is going to defend itself. It's clear that this was pre-incarnate Christ, pre-existent Christ. All right. So it's once again, I can't emphasize enough. It's vitally important that we allow the text to say what it has to say. When we read the text, it's not a reader response, but it is an author response. And what that means is that we can't interpret the text the basis in the way we want to interpret it. We have to allow the author to explain what he's saying. And then from that point, we interpret the text based on what the author says. And we come to conclusion by taking all the whole text into consideration. Not just one verse here, not cherry picking verses here, but taking all the verses into consideration to come to our conclusions. And if we do that when we're dealing with Jesus of the Old Testament, then hey, we can't help but come to the conclusion that Jesus Christ is God. Jesus Christ appeared many times in the Old Testament. All right, so the last part that I want to cover is typologies. What is a typology? A typology can be defined as a special kind of symbolism, a comparative foreshadowing indication that's seen in the Old Testament and fully revealed in the New Testament. The Greek word tupos, which literally means the mark or impression made on a soft substance by a blow. So to sort of give a better fundamental understanding of a typology, basically it's what we see in someone, maybe a character of an Old Testament, and we may see that person may be a type of Christ. So not Christ himself, but a type of Christ that we see in the New Testament. So it's a foreshadowing. It's a small bit of revelation, not the full blown fruition or the full blown revelation of Christ, but it's a little hint of what is to come. And we see this typology with Christ, and we see this with Christ in certain characters in the Old Testament. One of those characters is Joseph. Joseph is extremely popular. You remember the story where his brothers hated him, the son of Israel, the son of Jacob, and the favorite son of Jacob. And the brothers hated him because of that. And they hated him so much that they actually threw him in the pit, plotted his murder. They wanted to kill him, but one of the brothers said, no, we're not going to kill him, but we're going to throw him in the pit. And they threw him in the pit, and later on he was sold into slavery, and the rest is history. But when we look at the story of Joseph, there is a typology there, a clear-cut typology. We see one example is that he suffered by and saved many. When Joseph was taken to Egypt, he eventually became the right-hand man of the Pharaoh. And in so doing that, he had the power he had all the power essentially that Pharaoh might have had. He was the second man in charge, if you will. And because of that power and that influence, he was able to do the things that were required in order to save a great amount of people. There was a famine, and Joseph had many dreams about a famine, and Pharaoh made him the right-hand man. So in that, Joseph stored up grain, and because of that storing up grain, he saved many people. And we know before then that he also suffered from the hands of his brothers, and he was in jail falsely and things like that. And that's the same thing Jesus Christ went through. Jesus Christ suffered the atonement, right? He died on the cross in order to save many people. That's one indication of a typology. That's one indication that Joseph was something like the Christ, something like Jesus Christ. And we see over in Genesis 50:20, it says, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. Genesis 50:20 is usually used in the argument of does God predestine things? Do God even predestine evil, if you will? Does God decree evil? That verse is usually a good strong reference to the fact that God does decree evil. Not that he enjoys it or pleasures in it, but that he does decree it for his purpose. And we see that also with Jesus Christ, right? We know that Joseph in 50:20 told that to his brothers once the brothers knew who he was, and the brothers were saying, sorry. And Joseph just basically said, whatever you meant for bad, God meant it for good. So it is what it is. But we also see in Acts 2:23 that this man, referring to Jesus Christ, Peter referring to Jesus Christ, in his first sermon since being filled with the Holy Spirit, this man delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. Now, this is not a lesson on God predetermining things or decreeing things. No, this is not what that's about. But my point is that in the same way that Joseph suffered and saved many, it was God's plan as well for the Son to suffer and save many. And that points to a typology. That points to a typological gathering right there. That you see that cohesiveness there. Like I said, you remember I said earlier that when we battle with the text, when we get the text, not necessarily battle with it, but when we dive into the text, the proper way to interpret is let the text interpret itself. So we take some sections out of the Old Testament, we compare it to the New Testament. Is Christ a typology? Let's look and see what the characters are doing in the Old Testament, and let's look at Jesus Christ in the New Testament and see if this is a proper interpretation, if that is a proper understanding of foreshadowing. And we see, another type, not another type, but another example of Joseph being a type of Christ is he was sent out to retrieve those who hate him. We know that Jesus Christ was hated. He was hated. Those same sinners that he saved, that he desired to bring home to the kingdom, hated him. So we also remember in Genesis 37 where Joseph went out to retrieve his brothers, those who hated him. Another one is tempted but did not sin. In Genesis 39, we see that Joseph was tempted to sin. He was tempted to have sexual relations with one of the Pharaoh's men's wives. And what did Joseph do? He ran out with no clothes on just to get away from the sin. He did not want to fall into that. He did not want to sin against God. We also read that as Jesus as well, tempted by Satan. And what did Jesus do? He rejected the temptation. Another type there. And we see over in Genesis 39 that he brought up and found guilty on false charges. Does that sound familiar? Jesus was also brought up and found guilty on false charges. We see the typologies there. We can't deny it. The Bible is saying it. I'm not saying it. The Bible is clearly bringing these things together. It's raised, and we see in Genesis 41, 37, 56, it's raised up to the right hand of the Pharaoh. Like I said before, Joseph was raised up in the right hand of the Pharaoh, and the people bowed the knee to him in the same way, and was said to have saved the world from a famine. I pointed that out earlier, that Joseph was brought to the right hand. In the same way, remember Jesus Christ, he was lifted to the right hand of the Father. Isn't that interesting how the comparative nature that is, how it all fits together and it just comes together such cohesion there. And we can't deny it. Once again, the biblical text is teaching these things. All I'm doing is reiterating what the text says. We can't deny it. And we also read in Genesis 46, chapter 46 through chapter 50, he forgives and restores his sinful brothers and made them a part of the kingdom. Does that sound familiar? Jesus Christ forgiving his people, those who he would call brothers. You remember Jesus Christ said, hey, your brothers and sisters are out there waiting for you. And what did Jesus say? Those who worship the Father are my brothers, my sisters, and my mother. What did Jesus do? He forgave those, his brothers and sisters, and brought them into the kingdom. Just as Joseph did, forgave and restored his sinful brothers, those brothers who betrayed him, and brought them into the kingdom of Egypt. Sounds interesting, doesn't it? Sounds very interesting. There's no denying it. And lastly, this typology, we see one more example of it. It says Jesus was a greater Joseph. Jesus is the full revelation of what Joseph foreshadowed and represented. And that you can't deny that. It is absolutely true. That Jesus Christ is the greater Joseph. And this is not the only types that we see. I emphasize Joseph because it was a popular story. A lot of people know it without even diving deep into the text. We know this story. It's very popular. They like to do it on kids' cartoons. They like to do quick little videos on it. But we see the resemblance. We see the typologies. So are there other types that I have not mentioned? Of course there is. It wouldn't be right if there wasn't. So we also see Adam. The first man created. Jesus was a second Adam. The Bible is pretty clear. In one Adam, death came into the world. In the other Adam, life came into the world. So we see Moses as well. Moses was another type of Christ. And Jesus delivered his people from the hands of evil and confronted evil positive day. Jesus did that. He delivered his people. And those religious leaders, the Pharisees and Sadducees, were confronted by Jesus. Jesus confronted that evil head on, that hypocrisy head on. He didn't shade away from it. He did it head on. And we also see that by, the typology or the symbology or the foreshadowing of when Moses raised a bronze serpent up in order to heal those who were bitten by snakes, poisoned by snakes. And Jesus Christ references that. And that is a foreshadowing of when Jesus Christ will be raised on a cross. And what has happened when Jesus Christ raised on the cross? He heals us of our sin. He heals us from our transgressions. He delivers us from the power of sin. That's why the atonement is extremely important to understand that at the cross, the atonement was complete. He said that it is finished. That's why we can't go back on that. That's why the atonement is so significant, because in the same way that bronze snake was raised up in the air, is the same way, and healed those people from being sick. And we can use that and say that Christ being raised up on the cross healed those who were sick in sin. The same typology there, that same correlation. And we also remember the Noah's Ark. Who can forget Noah's Ark, right? Noah's Ark was a typology as well. Christ is that ark. He is that better ark. Did Christ save the whole world in that ark? No, he didn't. He saved a remnant. He saved those true believers. And inside that ark, we too are saved. We too are that remnant. We're saved. And that's why Christ is the better ark. And after they entered the ark, Noah's family entered the ark in safety, God's wrath was on the earth. He destroyed the earth by flood. And it's in that same nature, in that same concept, that Christ is our ark. Christ is that ark. And we are saved in that ark. And we're saved from the wrath of God. And it's important for us to understand that. It's important for us to see that. And lastly, Jonah. Jesus spent 3 days in the heart of the earth. After he died, he spent 3 days before he resurrected. And in the same way, Jonah spent 3 days in the belly of the fish, belly of the whale. We see those typologies. We see them. And it's just awesome because, once again, the Bible defends itself. There's no need for me to sit here and go back and forth trying to make you believe it. The Bible defends itself. Either you're going to accept what the Bible says about Christ being God, about Christ making appearances in the Old Testament, because God, the Father is spirit. There's no way he would make a physical appearance on earth because he's spirit. There's no way he can be physical. But Jesus Christ is physical. Jesus Christ is a body. And he made pre-appearances before the New Testament. He made appearances in the Old Testament. There's no denying that. No denying it. In order to sufficiently refute Christ's deity, one has to refute these clear indications of theophanies or Christophanies, foreshadowings, and or typologies. You have to refute that. In order to refute Jesus Christ's deity, you have to refute these clear-cut cases that Christ appeared in the Old Testament. If you cannot refute that point, then you have allowed the biblical text to show you the truth. And you're not pushing your presuppositions in there. The biblical text defends itself. And if you will just allow the biblical text to defend itself, if you will allow an author response to the text, then I'm pretty confident that you'll come to the correct interpretation of the text. But with that said, that's it. And I just want to reemphasize that Christ is not just someone in the New Testament. He's also someone in the Old Testament. I want to thank you for joining me on this lesson. I pray that this lesson is a blessing. Oh yeah, don't forget to like and follow and share this information. Remember, at the Gospel Truth, we are engaging the culture with the Christian truth. And what that means is that we're pushing the gospel to the ends of the world. There's no culture that we cannot engage. May God bless you and may God keep you. And look out for part 2 of Jesus in the Old Testament. God bless and take care.